I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today, and sorry not to be able to attend in person. My topic for this talk is democracy's fragility. Democracy is founded on a radical idea, the idea that collective political life should be based fundamentally on human freedom and equality, on respect for human freedom and equality, not fundamentally on honor for the wise, deference to the blessed, subservience to the rich, or awe for the powerful. Democracy is also a fragile achievement subject to erosion and collapse. There's much current discussion about democratic fragility, focused on globalization and the reemergence of ethno-national populism, a crisis of representation, the damaging impact of digital technologies on the public sphere, loss of confidence in a better future associated with stagnant incomes, threats of automation and climate change, and political polarization and hostility to expertise. In this talk, I'm going to explore a different piece of this vast subject of democratic fragility. My discussion will be based on three facts about human reason, human goods, and democratic values. First, the fact of reasonable pluralism, the fact that people have deep disagreements about fundamental values and understandings of the world that cannot be resolved through reason. Secondly, the fact of the hierarchy of values, the fact that for many people, democracy is not the ultimate good, even if it is an important and intrinsic good. And finally, the fact of the contestability of democracy, the fact that our understanding of what makes a political society democratic is complex and reasonably contested. Because of the hierarchy of values, democratic commitments are often conditional. Because of reasonable pluralism, those commitments are conditional in different ways for different people. And because of the contestability of democracy, democracy can unravel even as everyone thinks of their own commitments as unwavering and of others as betraying democratic values. I'll be exploring the fragility that grows from these three facts, but I want first to make a few points of clarification. First, fragile does not mean that democracy is fated to decline, but that its success depends on the thoughtful and vigilant action of members of democratic societies. Second, in my comments on democracy's fragility, I'll be putting aside issues of corruption and other kinds of malfeasance, destructive emotions such as hatred, jealousy, and envy, and also selfish indifference to important public values. To be sure, those factors play a significant role even in a well-functioning democracy. Still, I want to understand how democracy might be a fragile achievement even on favorable assumptions about humanity and social cooperation. Third, I mentioned the fact of reasonable pluralism about fundamental values as one source of human disagreement and potential conflict. But disagreement and conflict has other less fundamental roots as well. Well-functioning democracies do not transcend conflict, refashion people's souls, and foster consensus. Instead, democracy is a distinctive way to organize and process the disagreements and conflicts that are endemic to all human societies. These disagreements and conflicts are about economic fairness, how to ensure prosperity, how to protect the earth, how to define political membership, what values should be visible in the public culture, how best to ensure public safety and security, and how to live a decent and righteous life. These political disagreements and conflicts grow from differences of interest and identity, as well as differences of ultimate values. But some mix of conflicts on these different dimensions is, I will assume, always present. So how then are these persistent and pervasive disagreements and conflicts organized and resolved? Democracy is one way, and by democracy, I'll mean a political arrangement that meets four conditions. First, that there are regular competitive elections for positions that make law and public policy. Second, that there are protections of rights of speech and assembly that enable people to discuss and organize around contested public issues. Third, that the government is chosen through elections and actually makes law and policy. And fourth, that suffrage rights are more or less universally distributed to all resident adults. Of course, there are alternatives to democratic rule: single-party rule, dynastic rule, military rule, and priestly rule. I focus on democracy because I believe it has a special claim to legitimacy, a special claim to be able to justify the authority it exercises over those over whom authority is exercised. And I'll explain later this special source of legitimacy. So here's the picture. We have a society with conflicts that grow from individual and group interests, identities, and deep convictions. Why then should people accept the settlement of their disagreements through a democratic process? The miracle of democracy, Adam Przeworski says, political scientist Adam Przeworski, says that the miracle of democracy is that conflicting political forces obey the results of voting. What explains this miracle? Well, I'll distinguish three categories of answer and then focus on the third. The first answer is epistemic. The idea is that elections are a device for pooling opinions about the right answer to a contested question. Say, what's the best way to provide for public safety or security? The epistemic view makes three assumptions: that all participants have opinions on the right answer, and in their voting they express those opinions. Second, that there is a right answer to the question. And third, that everyone has a decent chance of getting the answer right. It follows from these assumptions that the majority is more likely to be right than the minority. As Rousseau observed, it follows from these assumptions that even if I lose in the vote, I have reason to accept the settlement because I think the resolution is more likely to achieve the result that I am aiming at than the alternative policy that I was previously supporting. That's because the real result that I'm aiming at is not that we do what I think the right answer is, but that we do the right thing. I'm concerned to ensure public safety. I have an opinion about how best to achieve that aim, but my fundamental concern is to achieve that aim, not to implement my opinion about it. Now, the central problem with the epistemic answer to the miracle of democracy is that it assumes away the political problem. The political problem comes from disagreements that people have about ends, about goals, not simply disagreements about the best means for achieving agreed ends. So a person who loses in a vote typically cannot treat the result as evidence that the right answer, the really right answer, is different from what he or she had previously supposed it to be. The political problem is that we have decided to do something that some of us disagree with. What kind of reason for accepting the decision what kind of reason do I and my group have for accepting the decision that is provided by the defining conditions of democracy? The epistemic answer doesn't really address that question. A second answer then is strategic. Here the idea is that individuals have reason for accepting the settlement, not because they think it's correct, as in the epistemic answer, but because they think that their best option is to play by the rules in the hope that the rules will remain in place and they may win the next time around. What matters most to them is not the democratic process itself, but achieving their aims. Still, they have reason to play by the rules and accept the result because the rules create uncertainty about who will hold power in the future. But this observation about the possibility of alternation in power leading to different outcomes in the future has nothing in particular to do with the democratic character of the decision. I might accept the decisions of a military authority because I think they might decide differently in the future. Nothing about democratic process itself matters. To be sure, democracy institutionalizes uncertainty about who holds power and what the outcomes will be, but the extent of uncertainty depends on all kinds of non-institutional factors as well. A strategic reason for accepting the results that seems more specific to democracy connects elections with power. The idea is that losing an election provides me with some evidence that my side is weaker, which means that non-acceptance of the decision and resistance to it is not advisable. The evidence that your side is weaker is simply that your side has fewer supporters. There's less power in smaller numbers. Now, this line of argument has some force, though it seems fundamentally flawed as a general account of the reasons for acceptance, because it assumes that power is simply a matter of numbers, which of course it's not. A third reason then, and the most compelling answer to what Przeworski calls the miracle of democracy, is normative. The idea is that people have reason to accept the results because the process that produces the results lays claim to be fair to individuals understood as free and equal participants. And here I come back to my earlier assertion that democracy has a special claim to legitimacy. That special claim derives most fundamentally from the ways that it respects values of freedom and equality. It justifies the provisional resolutions of social conflicts by providing a reason for each person to comply that does not require that person, to regard him or herself as of lesser worth, or as needing patrons, or as needing a master. Democracy implicates the value of freedom because of the combination of suffrage rights, rights of expression, and rights of association. Democracy depends on robust protections of suffrage, speech, and association. Those are the rights that people need in order to bring their interests, identities, and convictions to bear on public decisions. And it implicates the value of equality because more or less all adults have these basic rights, meaning that they have equal standing as participants in the process that authorizes a government to exercise law and policy-making powers. The basis of equality lies in our political capacity, a minimally sufficient capacity to understand the requirements of mutually beneficial and fair cooperation, grasp their rationale, and follow them in our conduct. The core idea then is that we owe equal respect to people who have this capacity, and that the moral distinctiveness of democracy is that it provides that respect. To be sure, as the fact of the contestability of democracy, the third of the facts that I began with, as that fact says, there are many ways to organize a democratic process that connect to different aspects of the idea of a fair process for making collective decisions that respects members as free and equal. But let's suppose that everyone thinks that the existing process is fair, and for that reason that they themselves have a good reason for complying with the result. Democratic process, politics is a way of organizing and regulating conflict, so the members of a political society ordinarily have conflicting and competing goals. Nevertheless, despite those conflicting and competing goals, they may all agree that the way to resolve disagreements ought to be fair to them as free and equal in the way that I've described. Well, let's assume now that a well-functioning democratic process is in place, that participants in the process think it is fair, and that, as is reasonable, they care about fairness. Still, they care about and have reason to care about other things besides fairness. Moreover, given the hierarchy of values, there's no assurance that the value of fairness overrides the value of the other things that people care about. There's nothing unreasonable about caring more about something other than fairness that might conflict with fairness, more than I care about fairness. I haven't argued this point, but let me at least illustrate it. For example, people have reason to care about their salvation. They have reason to care about public security. They have reason to care about the quality of the public environment that they live in, and reason to care about the preservation of the earth. And their concerns about each of these can come into conflict with fairness. So someone might agree that the resolution of conflicts through a competitive electoral process is fair, but not accept the resolution in a case in which the substance of the resolution conflicts with either their salvation or with what's needed for security or with the existence of a decent public environment or with the preservation of the earth. They care with good reason about fairness, but they care about and have reason to care about some good whose realization may conflict with fairness. So, for example, suppose I live in a community in which most people keep a Sunday Sabbath. I'm a Saturday Sabbatarian. A regulation is passed that denies me unemployment benefits if I refuse jobs that require me to work on Saturday. The decision is made through a fair democratic process. All the conditions of democracy are in place, and there's no hatred, there's no animus of people like me. Still, I don't accept the decision. My complaint is that the decision is fundamentally wrong, not that the process was unfair. The decision is wrong, despite the fairness of the process, because of the nature of the burden it imposes on me. The process, however, I think was a fair process. People disagree on what the right policy is, and some policy needs to be adopted, and this policy should be accepted because it results from a democratic process, which is indeed a fair process. In rejecting the result, I acknowledge that I am subordinating the value of fairness to the importance of doing something that I think my salvation depends on. Or consider a population deeply divided about the right national security policy and posture. The disagreements are profound and they are persistent because they reflect different fundamental ideas about human propensities to violence and about how people respond to displays of military strength. One group, the party of military strength, let's say, wins a series of elections, and they adopt policies of building greater military force because they think the world is profoundly dangerous and that visibly displaying those forces will induce fear in others. They thus have the conviction that the building and the displays will help to keep the peace. The other group, the party of restraint, is critical of military power. They believe that the world is made dangerous not by human propensities to violence, but by creating threats that others feel the need to respond to. So they believe that the building of the great military forces and the displays of those forces are creating threats to others, thus provoking new dangers. The party of restraint is convinced that the party of military strength is wrong, that their errors are very deeply rooted in their ideas about human nature, and that the errors are correspondingly hard to displace. The party of military strength, by my assumption, has won a fair victory. The victory comes through a democratic process. As a member of the opposing party of restraint, I think the process has all the democratic features that I normally regard as generating reasons for accepting the outcome. But in our circumstances, I think that their policy will mean increased threats to all of us. I think the decision is deeply wrong. I think it's dangerous, that it reflects misguided ideas about human beings and human conflict and threatens to reinforce those ideas with their malignant influence on the broader culture. So we have a conflict here between the fairness of the process that ordinarily gives me reasons for accepting the results of a democratic process, and another good, the good of public safety and security, that has fundamental value. It's reasonable for me to value public security more than fairness of procedures. I know that a majority disagrees with me. I know that the election underscores that disagreement. Moreover, I don't think of myself as being infallible or even a better judge than my opponents on many questions of law and policy. Still, I think that I have overriding reason to oppose the decision. I might even be inclined to say that the decision is perfectly legitimate, but that its legitimacy does not override my reasons for resisting the decision and the process that it issued from. It's democratically legitimate, but so deeply misguided and dangerous that I think it must be resisted. To see how this unwillingness to accept the decision might play out, I want to bring in the third fact that I mentioned at the beginning, the fact of the contestability of democracy. So suppose I'm a member of the party of restraint, and I think that the decision on security, on military force, would have been different if we had conducted our elections in a different way. Maybe I think that a shift from a majoritarian system to a system of proportional representation would have the effect of weakening the party of military power. Maybe I think that a proportional system and a majoritarian system are equally acceptable on grounds of fairness. Or maybe, having noticed the security benefits of a system of proportional representation, I'm drawn to the conclusion that a proportional system really is more fair. So I fight to change the rules of the democratic process, to move the results in a direction that I think is much less likely to create grave security threats. Now, the situation is symmetrical. The party of military power understands everything that I understand. They see that the results of a shift to a proportional system will work to their disadvantage, so they resist it. They reject the claim that proportionality has advantages of political fairness, and they insist that my group is simply manipulating the democratic process. So the conflict we have about how to provide the fundamental good of security has now also produced a conflict about the right way to ensure a democratic process. Neither side in the conflict is indifferent to democracy. They think of their own preferred form as a legitimate variant of fair democratic institutions. But we have this conflict about process as well as policy now. And because the disagreements are correlated, each side grows suspicious about the democratic commitments of their opponents. Suppose I'm in the party of military power. I observe my opponents working hard to change the political process to a system of proportional representation. And I see three ways to understand their efforts. It could be that they're indifferent to democratic values. It could be that they embrace democratic values, that they think proportional representation is a reasonable form of democracy, and they're supporting proportionality because it also advances their security views. Or it could be that they believe that proportional representation is indeed the best form of democracy, and they embrace it because it's best. Well, because their convictions about the virtues of proportionality have grown stronger in the wake of their troubles winning in a majoritarian system, I find it hard to believe that they've suddenly had a conversion to the special merits of a proportional system. If the first view is right, that they are indifferent to democratic values, then the other side is the party of peace, the party of restraint, is willing to break with democracy. If the second view is right, they think proportionality is fair, but they're really pushing for it because they want the policy of not building all these military forces. In either case, I'm concerned about the conditionality of their democratic commitments. I worry now I'm accepting the constraints of democracy while my opponents are treating democratic process as something to be bent and shaped to support other values. When the conflict about which form of democracy is best is so closely associated with a conflict about which policy is best, each side may understandably lose confidence in the democratic convictions of the other side. And they may think then that it's permissible to break the democratic rules, both because of their substantive commitments other than to the value of fairness, and because they're concerned that the other side is breaking the rules. Under these conditions, it's easy to see how democracy may erode. The erosion may be slow and incremental, not a decisive break, but nevertheless real. Well, having explored this source of democracy's fragility, I want now to briefly mention 3 ways of addressing it. Each of the 3 is philosophical, but I think that philosophy is of deep practical importance, not least because it provides us with a sense of orientation in the world. So the first reason is there is some truth to the strategic theory of democratic commitment, the second of the views that I described earlier, second of the answers to the miracle of democracy. This is the one focused on uncertainties that are built into democracy. Politics is always about exploiting possibilities, not riding on the back of inevitabilities. More to the point, the failure to achieve success in advancing your most fundamental values may change with subsequent political developments and may require concerted efforts to move the opinion of other people in different directions with no assurance of success. Preserving that uncertainty by ensuring that there are not permanent losers and permanent winners, and that elections as well as ideas remain genuinely contestable, is one way for sustaining democracy in the face of fragility. A second route is to foster public understanding of the fundamental values that democracy serves. Democracy isn't only a technology for processing conflicts and making decisions. It's also an expression, always partial and always compromised, of the very great values of fairness, equality, and freedom. Moreover, those values of fairness, equality, and freedom are not the unique possession of one moral or religious or philosophical tradition. They're widely shared among conflicting moral, religious, and philosophical outlooks, as John Rawls emphasized in his idea of an overlapping consensus. So it's essential to fostering an understanding of those fundamental values, of their great importance, to emphasize that they are a common ground that different people with different fundamental convictions can occupy. Finally, groups that witness their numbers eroding, that they are losing through the democratic process, may be tempted to break from democratic process because they think that democracy itself is the source of that erosion. But they may need to be reminded that their support may be eroding because their views strike others as wrong, or because their views are incompatible with public experience or with modern science and technology, not because public affairs are unfairly stacked against them. Finally, then, a brief conclusion. Democracy is a fragile achievement, even on favorable assumptions about humanity and social cooperation. So its fragility is not a condemnation of humanity. Democracy is also a great achievement, founded on the radical idea that a political society can treat human beings with respect as free and equal. Because it's fragile, we need to be concerned about its erosion. Because it's great, addressing that concern demands our deepest understanding and most determined efforts.